Anyone who came, by the way, hoping to learn their quiz score will have to wait until Friday. So that means you all have to come Friday too. You see, that's my little trick. That way I can get you to come to class. All right, well, how do we begin? Does anyone know French? A little? Oh, you can sing along then. Allons enfants de la patrie, le jour de gloire est arrivé. Contre nous de la tyrannie, les tendances sanglantes élevées, les tendances sanglantes élevées. Entendez-vous dans les campagnes mugir ces féroces soldats? Ils viennent jusque dans nos bras. Oh, you're good. Égorger nos fils et nos campagnes. Okay, so now, hang on. Now we're going to do the refrain, right? The refrain, right? So, you can all join in now. Aux hommes citoyens, formez vos bataillons, marchons, marchons, quand sang impur abreuve nos sillons. All right, let's hear what is your name again? Ahmet. Ahmet, excellent. I'm very impressed. By the end of the week, I want you all to be able to sing the Marseillaise. No, just the refrain. Just the refrain. When we get to 1792 and the Great War, I think it's good to get in the spirit of things. So where do you go back? I mean, with any major event like the French Revolution, you can obviously go back fairly far in time. We've already talked a little bit about absolutism. I think I wrote that up here, which we usually associate mostly with which king? Does everyone remember? Did you have a question? Or, oh, you're just, okay. Which king do we kind of associate it with the most? Louis, I know there are many Louis, it's confusing. The 14th, right. Louis XIV, the 14th. It's not that he invented the concept, it's just that he embodied it. You remember, he was the one who said, L'État, c'est moi, the state, it is me. Now, it's true, modern scholars will tell you that even at the height of his power, the Sun King had nothing like the power that many modern dictators had. You know, he didn't really have the power of life and death over all of his subjects. In a sense, he did, but not really in any actual, real administrative sense. That said, the concept, the aspiration of absolutism was very much that the king's authority was absolute, that it was unchecked. Now, particularly, we talked about the difference with England. Whereas in England, after the Glorious Revolution of 1688-89, you not only had a Protestant king on the throne, William of Orange, coming from the Netherlands, but you had the concept of parliamentary supremacy. That is, the real authority, particularly the power of the purse. Now, this is very significant. We should never forget this in modern history. The importance of the power of the purse. That is, who controls taxing and spending. This was held by Parliament in England, whereas in France it was held exclusively by the king. So we talked about the idea of public debt, that is the English debt, which was theoretically in the name of the nation, or at least of the Parliament, such that members of the House of Lords and Commons, they themselves had a kind of stake in it, and then ordinary citizens, by buying and selling government bonds, they themselves had a stake in it. The perception that it was public meant people were more confident it would be paid back. Now again, this all explains some of the difference in at least perception and success regarding public finance in both England and France in this era. But in France, to some extent, the problems went deeper. I alluded to this with some of these notorious taxes. I wrote one of them up here, the gabelle. The corvée was possibly the most offensive tax. The corvée was the one where it was almost like a labor tax. You know, you were told by the government that temporarily, for let's say the rest of the summer, you would have to go build a road. This being your obligation to the crown, to the king. Now, the gabelle, I don't think I explained it very well. It was salt, but It wasn't that you grew your own salt or you had to produce it. It was that you had to buy it. Now, it's true, everyone needs salt. As we all know, certain diseases, we may not know this, certain brain disorders like meningitis are actually accelerated or in fact made possible by a lack of salt in our diet. So salt is important. We all need it. But what the government did was it forced everyone to buy salt at extortionate prices. Prices at which the collectors of the gabelle basically turned a great profit. Now there were other taxes too. There was the taille. This was the more or less direct tax, almost like an income tax that everyone paid, except everyone didn't pay it, and that was the problem. The commoners paid it. We had the three estates, the first, the second, the third. I suppose I should have written this on the board. It's fairly simple, though. The first estate is the clergy, which is to say the church, members of the church. The second estate, this being the nobility, those with the coat of arms or who can trace ancestry back through a certain number of quarterings. The third estate is, again, just basically everyone else. The commoners, that is the non-nobles, those who were not members of the clergy, they had to pay all of the taxes. Now, it's usually said, which is unfair because they were the poorest. Well, it's true to an extent. The poorest did tend to fall in the class of the commoners, but they weren't all poor. Many people who were not nobles were actually doing pretty well. The term you usually hear, I personally don't like the term because I think it has somewhat anachronistic connotations, this term of the bourgeoisie. This is a particular term of importance for Marxist historians, this notion of burghers. If you actually look at the origins of the word, it's not necessarily that political. It originally came from the idea of townsman, Burg being Germanic for essentially town. And so the idea is the townsmen, not the nobles, not the peasants, but the people who traded, artisans, workers. Usually it means the more prosperous of them, that is, those who own property. You sometimes hear the term middle class, which is very confusing because usually when we're talking about the bourgeois or the burghers, we usually mean those who were pretty well off, those who were successful, who owned property. So if you see this term like in the reading this week, that's what we're really talking about. Possibly a banker, a trader, a merchant, maybe someone who owns a small shop, someone who does well for themselves, who probably owns their own house. Now these people, again, are pretty well off, and in some sense they're the real financial backbone of the government because they're the ones who actually paid the taxes. The nobles, see, part of their privilege was that they didn't have to pay the ordinary tax. Now, theoretically, there was a tax that sometimes would be leveled in wartime. It was called the vingtième, vingt meaning in French 20. Right, so it would be a 20th supposedly of not necessarily your income, but of your property. So if you owned a lot of land, you had to pay a 20th of its value in tax. But these taxes were never permanent. They were imposed usually only in wartime, as a special expedient, and as the 18th century, the 1700s wore on, they were imposed less and less commonly, in part because the nobles didn't like paying taxes, and so they started agitating against it. Now, everyone knew to some extent that there was something out of whack, that there was something wrong with this. It didn't seem right that the commoners paid all the tax. Meanwhile, the first estate, it's even more confusing. The clergy, that is the church, they don't pay any tax at all, but they do give money to the crown. But they call it a gift. So they call it a free gift. In other words, we give it freely, which also means, of course, if we don't want to give it, we won't give it. Now, you can understand why a bondholder, or someone wanting to buy bonds in the French monarchy, that is, wanting to loan money to the kings, wouldn't like looking at this. You know, if we were in a modern system and we had a rating agency like Moody's, for example, they would say, well, look, you've got the clergy, and they call their own contribution to public finance a gift, which means they can withhold it at any time. You're not taxing many of your richest citizens, the nobles, at all. And when you do, it's temporary and easily revoked. So I don't really trust that you have a good long-term plan for your finances. There were other problems too. I talked about them before. This notion of venality. I wrote that on the board, I think, last week. That is the buying and selling of public office. Again, where, let's say someone, usually in the nobility, but sometimes you could actually buy nobility. That was the other thing, is if you got the right title, if you paid enough money, you would be ennobled. That is, you would go from the third estate to the second. It was a little bit like you're paying a bribe to improve your social status. Now this, again, raised money in the short term, but in the long run, it cost money because these offices had salaries which the government had to pay. So it was not a very efficient way of raising money. Now there were other kooky ways too. I talked about this lifetime annuity, literally gambling on the life of a person. There were all kinds of strange expedients, or you might call them techniques, the monarchy used. None of them very logical to raise money. Well, the upshot, as we remember from last week, was again that France was paying a much higher rate of interest. I said that in the year 1781 they were paying an average of about 6% versus 3% that was for England, for Great Britain, even though both had a roughly equivalent tax burden. Well, that's important. Keep that in mind. But history is not always just about numbers, because after all, things can change. It's not like the French government had to collapse. It did not have to go bankrupt. I mean, governments have been irresponsible before. Governments will be irresponsible again. You don't always get something as colossal as the French Revolution. It was a concatenation, one might say, of circumstances, some of which was political. It wasn't just financial, although there were elements of the financial to it. To kind of cut the story short, we could usually begin, at least traditionally, in the 1770s. This is right about the time that Louis XVI replaces his father. You could probably guess. His father was also called Louis, right? He was Louis XV, right? So he replaces his father, Louis XV. Who himself, it's a little confusing. There were a couple of non-Louis in between Louis XIV and the 15th, as you might expect, because there were a number of years in between them. But anyway, so Louis XVI, the one who's famously going to marry Marie Antoinette with fateful consequences. I think it's 1774. But the appointment was actually made by his father, Louis XV. The appointment, that is, of Turgot, who was the first in the line of what we might call a reforming minister. Not like, if you remember, Richelieu, who was, and he was kind of innovative, but he was also very much in favor of the traditional ways as far as monarchical privilege. Turgot was what was called a physiocrat. This was kind of the French version of what you had in England, usually associated with Adam Smith, the idea of laissez-faire or liberalism. It wasn't quite the same thing. But it's almost at the same time. I don't really have any more room up here, but you might remember from Hijiv or your other classes that The Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith was published in 1776. So you have a kind of commonality of ideas, although it's not exactly the same thing. Adam Smith was talking about, among other things, the idea of specialization, what Ricardo would later call comparative advantage. Essentially just this notion of enlightened self-interest. The phrase you usually hear, the invisible hand, that is, the market kind of does its thing. Everyone, the butcher sells me, the meat, not because he likes me, but because it's to his advantage, it's also to my advantage, etc., etc. Well, that idea was pretty simple. The French idea was similar, but in France it was partly that they realized something was wrong, and so there was a kind of more aggressive bent to their critique. Now this was true of the philosophes too. I probably should have gone back a little bit further. The physiocrats, they're not quite the same as the philosophes. The physiocrats, they're more interested in kind of economics, administration, and trade. The philosophes were interested in a lot of things. We usually think of, when we think of the philosophes, we think of Voltaire. You might also think of Rousseau, although confusingly, he and Voltaire didn't agree on very much. There was also D'Alembert. Do you remember any of Montesquieu, sure. Montesquieu, they all have slightly different emphasis. Montesquieu was more interested in law. Montesquieu was more interested in geography and in kind of systems, also the aristocracy and its traditions. Rousseau was the radical. You probably read The Social Contract in Hijiv? Probably, okay. So you remember The Social Contract then from Hijiv, the famous concept of the general will or the volonté générale. Voltaire, the key phrase that what we associate with Voltaire, at least for our purposes, I think, this week, is his idea of écraser l'infâme. We usually translate this colloquially in English as something like crush the infamous thing. He means bigotry or superstition. Basically, this is about an attack on the church. L'infâme could be anything, like the bad thing, the thing we don't like. You know, crush the thing we don't like. In other words, fight. So it could be superstition, bigotry, religion. Many of the philosophes were atheists, or borderline atheists, or as they like to call it, deists. That is, someone who believed there was a system, right, but that there was no God who was the idea of a clockmaker. God had created the universe, but then did not actively intervene, as he did, for example, in Islam, where God was supposedly involved in everything. Anyway, some of them were actual atheists. I mean, some of them were real rakes. They actually dabbled in pornography and such, I kid you not. There's actually a movie about Diderot that came out about 10 years ago. I think it was called Le Libertin, The Libertine. Has anyone watched this? It's one of those French movies where everyone's naked most of the time. No, seriously, Diderot spends the first half of the movie almost an hour naked. He's getting his portrait done by, you know, some female artist, and his wife comes in and gets jealous, so he chases her around, naked, for like an hour in this movie. I mean, it's really stunning. But anyway, so this is actually true of them. They believed in breaking down all barriers. So the idea that the church was kind of blocking, through its strictures on morality, was blocking freedom of expression of ideas, but also freedom of sexuality, what a later age would call free love. The physiocrats, the barriers, see, everyone wants to break down barriers, like all revolutionaries, right? The idea is that there are these kind of magical, or one might call them unmagical barriers that are preventing us from realizing our potential. A very kind of a youth-friendly idea. They weren't all young. But the physiocrats wanted to break down economic barriers, particularly things like tolls, taxes. Taxes they didn't like the gabelle and the corvée, but also things like customs barriers. Did you have a question, or is it something else? Yeah, physiocrats, yeah. Yeah, mostly, right. Customs, you know what like a toll is, I assume? Right. A toll would be not a tax exactly, but a toll like a tariff. A tariff would be, as we usually call it, from outside the country. But France had a lot of internal tolls. That is, if you were bringing a bale of goods, you know, to Paris from the south of France, you would pass through all of these kind of internal customs barriers, and every time you would have to pay a tax. And so this hurt trade, not only international trade, but trade inside of France. Anyway, so the physiocrats wanted to tear down those barriers. The philosophes, you know, Rousseau was the most radical, talking about republicanism, but the others, at the least, they wanted certain political reforms. Now, Voltaire represented the kind of anti-clerical wing, that is, hostility to the church, which is actually very significant for, I think, a Turkish audience, in that a lot of, at least Kemalism, or at least laïcité, is based very much on this French tradition of anti-clericalism, which goes back to Voltaire. But anyway, so back to the financial crisis, because, again, it all comes together. You know, you have ideas percolating around, and part of the reason the ideas get more radical is that in a country like England, where many of the elites could actually participate in public life. You know, there was Parliament, there was a Bank of England, there was public discussion of affairs. People felt, at least through their votes, that they had some influence. In France, they had no influence, right? You have absolutism. On the other hand, you also have all of these rich people, some nobles, some non-nobles, who all have ideas and they want to change things, but they have no power. And so they get very frustrated. The first of them who actually does attain government office and tries to do something, as I said, was Turgot. Again, physiocrat. He starts small. He wants to basically tear down some of the customs and toll barriers. He actually does, at least briefly, get rid of the corvée, this hated labor tax, which the physiocrat saw as, again, not only kind of offensive and unpleasant, unfair, but also inefficient. Because, after all, it was kind of free labor. It was not wage labor. If the government wanted to build roads, the government should hire people and pay them a fair wage. That's the kind of economist answer. So he gets away with that. He starts talking also about a more equitable tax system. He wants to tax, at least to some extent, the nobility. Remember, they have an exemption from the ordinary tax, from the tithe. And so he tries to do this. But he runs up against a lot of opposition. It's mostly centered, and it's a bit confusing because the nobility is broken into all of these different parts. We usually call them the nobles of the robe. Those who wore, a little bit like a bathrobe, like you would put on. That's why they were called the nobles of the robe. That was the costume that they wore. It was very grand, of course. They were either judges. It's a little confusing. The thing called the Parlement of Paris, it sounds like parliament, but it was really a court. It was something like the Supreme Court. Like the one America has today, or the one you have here. I forget what it's called. The court, the highest court. Yeah. Yeah. It's sort of like the highest court of the land, which registers laws. That is, it determines whether the laws are valid or not. Except that, of course, in the absolutist system, theoretically, any law that the king says is a law is automatically valid. But these nobles, it's not just that they're a little bit tired of absolutism. Did you have a question then? No, okay. It's not just that they're kind of tired of absolutism because they themselves want to be involved. But they also have an economic self-interest. They don't want to pay higher taxes. They don't want to pay taxes at all, basically. And so you have a combination of things. You have a kind of obnoxious upper-end aristocracy with a kind of social snobbery looking down on this minister, Turgot, who himself is not of the high aristocracy. But you also have economic self-interest. They don't want to pay tax. So they basically block these laws and they start denouncing Turgot and saying, we will not stand for this. And the king backs down. And essentially Turgot is fired. And this is partly because the new king, Louis XVI, was still very young and inexperienced. He wasn't very confident. But of course, this doesn't really change. Personalities don't change overnight. He remains that way. This is very important to remember, that when people talk about history as being predetermined, when you talk about social forces and so on, a lot does depend on personality. And the last monarch of pre-revolutionary France, Louis XVI, was famously not a very confident man. He was not particularly clever either. He wasn't an idiot, but he definitely was not very strong-minded. He was not very strong-willed. He also made the political mistake of marrying Marie Antoinette, who was actually a Habsburg. That is, she came from the Austrian royal house, traditional enemy of France, even if they had been together in the 7 Years' War. Traditionally, most French still thought of Austria as essentially hostile. Now, she herself, being very well-born, was in some ways more confident than her husband. In fact, part of the view of Louis XVI, which seeped out into the popular press, was that he was, as we say in English, henpecked by his wife. That is, that she controlled him, that she was stronger than him. There were also rumors of impotence, that is, that he was not able to perform in bed. He was not able to produce the heir that the monarchy needed. A lot of this stuff factors into political life and becomes very important. But anyway, so he's kind of weak. He doesn't stand by Turgot. Now, the same thing happens again with the next key minister, Jacques Necker. Now, Necker he's a controversial figure even among historians, because a lot of historians think he was full of it. He was kind of the designated fall guy or victim before the revolution, who they have to bring back right before the revolution to appease the popular crowd, to appease the kind of the liberal-minded types. Now, what he tries to do is interesting. He doesn't even have as strong a position as Turgot politically, because he's not even French. He's actually Swiss. That's important to know. This is part of the reason the king hired him, because the Swiss, like the Dutch and the English, had a better reputation when it came to financial matters than the French did. So it's like he hires a foreigner. You know, it's like bringing in, say like bringing in the IMF, say like a contemporary analogy, right? It's kind of, it might be a good idea, but politically it's risky because he's a foreigner. And Necker himself, he comes in at a very difficult time. If we remember this period, although it goes back even before Necker's, back to 1775, this is the period of which war? Do we remember? About 1775 or so until 1781. Yeah, the American is sometimes called Revolutionary War. That's a perfectly legitimate name for it, the American Independence War. The Americans call it the Revolutionary War. Right, independence from Great Britain. Won partly by their own arms, but also largely due to financial and armed support from the French and the help of the French Navy. France actually spends a colossal amount of money on this war. More than you might think. More than the Americans maybe like to be reminded of, because it was the French in a way who really paid for it. Yes, the Americans paid back a lot of the money in interest, but still, the French put up the dough. Now, as I said, though, he's a foreigner, so he's in kind of a tough position. He saw what happened to Turgot, who tried to raise taxes on the nobility. He doesn't think he can do that. You know, he's not even French. He knows they're not going to like it. So what he says instead is, look, you're not going to let me raise taxes, so I have to raise loans. But I'm going to try to borrow money at slightly better rates of interest. I will try to borrow it with long-term bonds that, again, don't pay out at such high rates. And I will try, meanwhile, to assure France's creditors that I actually have a plan to pay them back. And so what he starts doing is he makes what he calls economies. That is, he cuts certain expenditures, which are particularly visible. Particularly those offices. I talked about the venality, the people who had bought government offices. He buys a lot of them out. That is, he pays them a sum to retire so that those offices are essentially killed and abolished. He does this with thousands of government offices. He has to pay some money up front, but the long-term savings, he thinks, will be good. So they save supposedly about 2 or 3 million. This is the currency, L-I-V-R-E-S, if you see it in the textbook, the livre, which originally was supposed to be like pound, which is what the word means, except that because of inflation and poor finance, the French livre is no longer even close to equivalent to the British pound. But that's what it's supposed to be. This is the French currency. And so what he's basically trying to project now is, look, we may be spending a lot of money now, but it's because it's a war. So that's like extraordinary or special expenditure. But I am cutting ordinary expenditure. So he's trying to signal to creditors that he has a plan. So what happens? Towards the end of the war, he actually puts up the first budget. It's called the compte rendu, or essentially just kind of account rendered. It's the first actual public accounting of expenses, income, expenditures in France, more or less. Now this compte rendu is controversial because a lot of people think that he sort of distorted the picture. He made it look better than it really was. But what he tried to do was to project out future expenses, assuming that the war would end and that expenses on the war would be ended. That is, if we go back to ordinary expenditure, this is the plan. The budget will be balanced. That's what he said. Now, as it turned out, the budget wasn't balanced, but that's partly because he lost his job and partly because his economies were abandoned. Now, as to whose fault it is, ultimately I think you have to go to the king. Now, he wasn't fired like Turgot was. It was a little different. It's confusing. He basically tells the king he has a he's almost like a minister without portfolio. He's foreign, so he doesn't really have a proper title or office. He's almost just like an advisor. He tells the king, look, if we're going to put through my program, and eventually we are going to need to raise taxes, although I don't have the authority to do that now, you have to give me a proper title, you have to give me your confidence, you have to promise to stand behind me. And just like Turgot, he has already pissed off some of the nobles, particularly the foreign minister of Vergennes. You don't have to remember his name. But so Necker has opposition among the nobility, that is, the second estate. He hasn't raised their taxes yet, but they think he's going to. So they start, whispering behind the scenes, oh, we have to get rid of this guy. He's a populist. He ultimately wants to tax us. He's not really French. He's not one of us, etc., etc. The king mulls it over. Like I said, he was indecisive. He was weak. He didn't fire Necker. That would have actually been a strong thing to do. Instead, he just kind of said, I don't know. In other words, he didn't fire him, but he also said, I'm not going to give you the title you want. I can't do that. I don't want to have a fight with the nobles on my hand. And so Necker said, okay, well then no thanks. You're on your own. And he resigns. Now immediately things get worse. Yet again, the expenditures kind of go back to spiraling out of control. Things get really, really bad under Calonne. And he, in some ways, is the real villain when you look at kind of the financial history of the old regime. He has his defenders. But for the most part, I think economic historians are now pretty much agreed that everything he did was pretty screwy. Not only did he bring back all those venal offices that Necker had gotten rid of, but he actually began spending a lot of money for no particular reason. Now, if you look at how much they borrowed, in about 4 or 5 years of a major war, Necker borrowed about 530 million livres. That's his new loans. Now, in less than 3 years, Calonne borrowed 653 million. That is more, despite the fact that France was at peace and was not actually fighting a war. What do they spend all the money on? Well, some of it was on the military. There were some famous projects for the Navy that were exceptionally expensive. Like they were building these great big cones out in the ocean. I don't even know what they were supposed to do. But they were supposed to, I guess, kind of shelter the French fleet from the British, except most of them sank without trace. Lots of money wasted. But no, mostly he spent money on the court, on Versailles, on parties and banquets and functions. And he actually came up with a theory behind this spending. He called it the splendor principle. Splendor being an English word, essentially meaning kind of, glamour or luxury. His idea was that in order to demonstrate to France's creditors that the monarchy was healthy, you wanted to make the monarchy look like it was rich. And so you spent as much money as possible, basically. That was literally his theory of public finance. You spend as much money as possible to convince people that you have money. Now, I mean, some people actually do this, like in their ordinary lives. It's generally not a good idea. Living off your credit card, buying things you don't need with your credit card, and having no plan to pay them back, which is pretty much what happened. So, as you can imagine, after a couple of years of this, the creditors who had only just begun to trust France again were now beginning to hesitate. So Calonne gets desperate. He calls this thing, they call it the Assembly of Notables. 30 people. 30 of the richest, most illustrious people in France. Now, politically speaking, it was not the dumbest thing to do. It was kind of clever in a way. He basically said, look, most of you are nobles and you don't pay taxes. And we all know how filthy rich you are. And so, frankly, I think you should be doing your share. So basically what he does is he calls together a conference of rich people to berate them, to kind of like accuse them of not paying their taxes. Now, his idea being that if they agree with him and they agree to pay their taxes, they will signal that they can finally put this tax on the nobility that everyone knows France needs. The notables, well, they didn't react so positively. They didn't like being blamed for France's bankruptcy. They thought Calonne was the one who had been spending all the money, and they thought that was the real problem. And so essentially they told him to shove it. They said, no thanks, no way, no how. Calonne, the whole thing is a disaster. It's a fiasco. He's embarrassed. He's humiliated. So, of course, I don't remember whether he resigned or was fired. But anyway, he obviously loses his job. By this point, the monarchy really is getting desperate. They have a new finance minister, Brienne, but you don't have to remember his name. He's not really the most important. He's kind of almost like a caretaker. You know, they have a couple new plans, but basically the king is finally convinced by Brienne and his other advisors that there's nothing left to do but for the king himself to go to the Paris Parlement and just tell them, look, we need a tax on the nobility. Or as he put it, a uniform tax on everyone. I don't know if the term was uniform, landed tax, uniform tax. Basically, they want to tax the nobility because otherwise the monarchy will never be able to meet its expenses. The budget is completely out of whack. You know, they're spending 2/3 of all of the money that they have just on servicing debt. And they're spending an even higher percentage of the money they're actually earning every year on debt because they're borrowing more money every year. You know, this is like that point of no return that certain public economists talk about. France is virtually bankrupt. Well, here's where things get really interesting. I mean, the story, the way I've heard it, it's not one of those things where we know exactly what happened. There were some, people sort of recording, but they didn't have typewriters. They're kind of recording what happened. Supposedly, the king goes to the Paris Parlement. And here is where he is supposed to finally shine, right? The absolutist monarch is going to lay down the law. After all, his word is law. The state is me. In fact, there was even a phrase, le roi, le veut. Now, you see, I put an L here. This is the old French spelling. Those of you who know modern French, veut, just V-E-U-T. This means, the king wants it. The king so desires. Essentially, this is the law, le roi, le veut. And so this is what the king is supposed to say. And instead he said something like, oh, le roi voudrait peut-être, si ça vaut mieux, si vous pourrez m'aider un peu. In other words, he doesn't talk like an absolutist monarch. He talks like a sniveling sort of weakling who's not sure of himself, who doesn't have confidence. And instead of then, proclaiming by acclamation that they agree that this is law, the Paris Parlement says, no. They nullify the law. They say, no, we will not register this law. Again, theoretically, they're kind of arguing because the law somehow violates the spirit of the ancient laws and constitution, blah, blah, blah. But basically, it's politics. The king wants it. The nobles don't want to give it to him. Now, again, theoretically, if you were to ask them in public, they would say, we're not opposed in principle to the idea of paying taxes, but we're not going to do it just by blackmail, by the king, kind of like Calonne did it. So what happens now? Well, things spiral out of control. And part of what makes the story so fun is that, a little bit like in ancient Roman times, they had these things called augurs. Like before the opening of a new consulate, for example, they would consult the heavens and see, is there bad weather? Is there something going on that we need to worry about? Is there a bad omen? Well, there were really bad omens in France. One of them, actually, the most remarkable one, was that on the 5th of July, there was actually a great hailstorm in Paris. Hail is, it's like rain that comes down in solid blocks. Like the size of sort of American baseballs almost. It's exceptionally rare. And it's particularly rare in the summer. And this hail that comes down, it seems like this biblical plague from the sky. Everyone started panicking what's going on. There were 2 consecutive bad harvests, particularly the one from 88 to 89, right before the revolution. This is one of the famous things. One of the reasons there were bread riots in Paris was that there had been a very bad harvest the year before. There wasn't enough seed, there wasn't enough grain, there wasn't enough bread in the markets. Prices were shooting through the roof. So you have inflation, you have bad weather, and all of the rest of it. But ultimately you had a single thing. You can actually date the collapse of absolutism as a political system to the 16th of August, 1788. This is when we have what is called a run on government paper, which is to say the value of the bonds, the Paris bonds on the bourse. There is a bourse where they're traded in Paris now, but essentially they're all originating from Amsterdam or from outside the country. But people can still buy and sell them in Paris. They can trade them. Remember, that's the notion, again, of buying and selling to third parties, which is supposed to be a good thing. But it's also dangerous because if people suddenly decide they don't want to hold this paper anymore, they don't trust that the government's going to pay back, they all try to dump it. This is what people today talk about, the day of reckoning, which might happen for the United States if suddenly people decide that the United States cannot pay back its debts on anything like the schedule it is promised to. Then people will start dumping the bonds. They may also dump the dollar. Some of it, of course, has already been happening. But this is what literally happens. The government bonds start to plummet. Everyone is selling, and no one is buying. It's a little bit like what happens in a stock market panic. The prices just literally start going like this. The government cannot raise money. It is down to something like, of these leave, we talk about the figures, right? How much they're spending every year. It's something like 700 million. They're down to 400,000. That's all they have in the treasury. This is enough for like a day of expenses. So essentially they're bankrupt. No one will loan them money. No one will buy the bonds they have already issued, and no one will give them more bonds. So the king is desperate. He is no longer an absolutist monarch. He realizes this. He tried to get Parliament to pass the new taxes. They didn't. Now he's bankrupt. He's broke. No one will loan him money. Something has to change. So he does two things in succession to restore public credit. Not of absolutism, but just of the government itself. First, he brings back Necker, because Necker is seen as, again, the man the markets trust. He also has a certain popular reputation, among the kind of the radicals, and particularly the kind of the street mob, the people who read pamphlets and things like that and gossip in the street in Paris. He's got the reputation. He's the one the people want. He brings back Necker, though, and although the markets react somewhat positively and they get a few new loans, Necker himself says, look, you can't put this all on me. I can't do everything myself, because the ultimate problem is I don't have the authority to put through these taxes. Nor do you. You need a higher public authority. You need a real parliament. You need the Estates General. Remember the three estates and the Estates General. Now, do any of you remember from the lecture on Richelieu? He actually addressed them back in, I think it was 1614, I think. It hasn't met since 1614. It is now 1788. We have mathematicians here. Let me do a basic subtraction. How many years have passed? 174 years. Almost, we got 1 3/4 centuries. That's a lot of generations. Back in an age when people married at an earlier age, when people married at like 15, at least the women at like 15 or 16, you can say that represents how many generations then? Well, yeah, you're talking about 10, 12 generations of people. There is no one in living memory who even knows what this thing really did. They have some old records, yes. They have some vague, sort of misty notion of what the thing is, that it's supposed to represent the three bodies of the realm coming together. But it's not like the British Parliament. It has no real power. It hasn't met in 175 years. Well, here's the thing. Remember, if the monarch was strong, if he were a real absolute monarch, what would he say? He would say, okay, well, look, we're gonna meet this thing. But then he would also say how it was going to meet, right? He would say, this is how we're going to elect it. This is what the rules are. This is how the votes are going to happen. This is how the laws will be enacted. But he's not that kind of monarch. And so what he does instead, I cannot emphasize how strange and bewildering this is. He essentially asks the public for suggestions. One clever historian called this an essay contest on the constitution of the realm. He invites the public to suggest how they will elect the Estates General, how it will convene and assemble, how it will vote, what sort of powers it will have. He invites suggestions. He says, please, I'm all ears. Tell me. In a way, it's kind of admirable. But on the other hand, again, we're not anymore in the days of a monarch who says, le roi le veut. It's more like, Le roi veut de l'information de tout le monde. He needs information from everyone in France because he doesn't know what to do. And so amazingly, people start writing up these essays. And they also assembled, there was something of a precedent for this thing they call cahier de doléances. This basically just means it's like a list of grievances. Or as we might put it in colloquial modern English, things that piss you off. You're supposed to talk about whatever it is about government, the economy, taxes, what have you, that bother you. Now, a lot of these are very local things. You know, they're like, look, we've been asking the king for years to drain out this swamp or do this or do that, and they never do it. Or we've been asking, the local notables, the local intendant, the local representatives of the government. But a lot of them are much more general. They talk about the inequities of the tax system, how the nobles don't pay their fair share. They talk about the customs and toll barriers. It all, again, it sounds like a great thing. Part of the problem, though, with this is that it's not just that the king is losing control. To a certain extent, this happens in all modern revolutions. I mean, the French Revolution is usually seen as the template. It's almost like a blueprint for modern revolutions. They always get more radical as they go. Whoever starts them, which usually it's someone in the upper nobility or among the higher classes, who usually have some problem with, let's say, a king or someone above them, they start it. This was all started, remember, by the Paris Parlement, some of the highest nobles in France. Things are now spinning out of their control because the king is now asking the people for suggestions. And the people, it's one of those phrases, what does it really mean? The people, le peuple. The people means, of course, whoever claims to speak for the people, which may very well be a group larger than the nobility or the clergy, larger than the first two estates. But probably it's still going to be those who were educated, who were literate, who were interested in public affairs, who were good at complaining. What am I getting at here? It's the lawyers. It's the lawyers, basically. You get a sort of plague of avocats, right? The lawyers come in and gradually they start to take over the country. Now, it wasn't just lawyers. There was one man, how are we doing on time, by the way? It's 30, okay. Well, when we get back, I'm going to introduce you to the Abbé Sieyès and his pamphlet, What is the Third Estate? As we roll into the glory days of the French Revolution.